The cold was not merely an absence of heat, it was a physical presence. It was a predator that stalked the narrow, muddy street of the town, sinking its teeth into the clapboard walls of the buildings and breathing a frost that feathered the inside of the window panes. It had a sound, too, a low, incessant moan as the wind swept down from the gray, bruised-looking mountains that loomed like grim sentinels over the valley. The wind carried the scent of pine and the sharper, more desolate smell of snow on its way. Huddled in the shallow alcove of the mercantile, a woman and a small boy were losing their battle against it. They were a study in displacement, their clothing thin and dark and utterly inadequate for the biting reality of this high country autumn. The woman's shawl was a flimsy thing, more suited to a city evening than a mountain gale. The boy, who could not have been more than 6, wore a threadbare coat and shivered violently, his face a pale, pinched oval tucked against his mother's side. They were islanded by the town's indifference, a piece of driftwood washed up on a hostile shore. People hurried past, heads bowed, collars turned up, their eyes sliding over the pair as if they were nothing more than a shadow, a trick of the failing light. He saw them from across the street, a solid, deliberate shape emerging from the smithy. The man was built of the same hard materials as the land itself. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind, and a solitude that had settled deep into the lines around his eyes. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years spent wresting a living from an unforgiving earth. He stopped, not out of pity, but with a quiet, searching attention. He had seen desperation before. He had felt its cold hand on his own heart. What he saw in the woman was something beyond that, the brittle, exhausted calm of a soul that had run out of road. He crossed the street, his heavy boots making solid, measured sounds in the frozen mud. He did not approach them directly, but stood a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the grim-faced mountains. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind's mournful song and the boy's chattering teeth. He knew what people would say. He knew the whispers that followed him like his own shadow. The solitary man in the high valley, the one who had lost everything, the one whose cabin was filled with a silence that was becoming too loud to bear. "The snow will be here by morning," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough as unsanded pine. It was not a greeting. It was a statement of fact, a piece of irrefutable truth. The woman flinched, pulling the boy closer. She did not look at him, but her chin lifted with a ghost of defiance. "We are aware," she answered, her own voice quiet but clear, laced with an accent that was not from around these parts. It was softer, more refined, and as out of place here as her thin shawl. He watched her for another long moment. He saw the pride warring with the stark fear in the set of her shoulders. He saw the fiercely protective way she held her son. He had a need. They had a need. The logic of it was as clean and cold as the mountain air. "I have a ranch," he said, still not looking at her. "It's isolated. I need a cook, someone to keep the house. The work is hard, but the roof is sound and the pantry is full." He paused, letting the words settle. "There will be talk. This town feeds on talk." He finally turned his head, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, met hers. They were devoid of warmth, but they were also devoid of judgment. They were simply direct. "Marry me for the winter. It's a contract, a name and a roof for you and the boy. In the spring, when the pass is clear, you'll be free to go. I'll give you severance to see you on your way." The offer hung in the air between them, as stark and shocking as a lightning strike. It was not a proposal. It was a business transaction, a desperate, pragmatic solution to two different kinds of emptiness. The woman stared at him, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, terrifying flicker of hope. She looked down at her son, whose shivering had worsened, his small face now tinged with blue. She looked at the hostile street, at the faces that had offered no help, no kindness. She looked back at the stranger, at this solid, unreadable man and the impossible bargain he had laid at her feet. Survival was a brutal calculus. It stripped away everything but the essential. "Why?" she asked, the word a whisper of sound. "I have my reasons," he said, his gaze returning to the mountains. "They have nothing to do with you. My wagon is behind the livery. The storm's coming." He turned and walked away without another word, without looking back to see if they would follow. His confidence was not arrogance. It was a simple understanding of their sheer absence of any other option. For a long moment, the woman remained frozen, the man's words echoing in the frozen air. A name, a roof, a winter. It was more than she had dared to pray for. It was a lifeline, thrown from the most unexpected quarter. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like it was tearing something loose inside her, she took her son's small, cold hand. "Come, Leo," she whispered. She led him out of the alcove and into the wind, following the tracks of the solitary man. The journey to the homestead was conducted in a silence as vast and profound as the landscape they traveled through. The man, Silas, handled the team with an ingrained competence, his movements sure and economical. The woman, Ilara, sat beside her son, Leo, on the wagon bench, a rough wool blanket he had wordlessly retrieved from the back wrapped around their shoulders. The fabric was coarse and smelled of hay and cold leather, but its weight was a small, solid anchor in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. The kindness, if it could be called that, was impersonal, as sharp and dangerous as the winter itself. He had not offered it for her comfort, she knew, but for the boy's survival. A frozen child would be an inconvenience. As they climbed higher into the foothills, the town fell away, a small, insignificant collection of smudged lights in the deepening twilight. The world narrowed to the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves, the creak of the wagon wheels, and the rising shriek of the wind. The first flakes of snow began to fall, not the gentle drifting kind, but hard, stinging pellets that struck her face like tiny shards of glass. The landscape grew wilder, the trees taller and darker, their branches clawing at the bruised sky. It was a place that did not welcome people. It endured them. Ilara looked at the man's profile, stark and unyielding against the failing light. Who was he? What grief had carved those lines so deeply into his face? His offer was madness, a bargain struck in desperation, but as the wagon jostled on, a strange sense of inevitability settled over her. She was no longer drifting. She was being carried toward a destination, however temporary, however strange. It was a terrifying relief. The homestead appeared suddenly, a collection of dark, solid shapes huddled against the base of a towering, pine-choked ridge. A long, low cabin, a sturdy barn, and several smaller outbuildings stood starkly against the whitening ground. A plume of smoke rose from the cabin's stone chimney, a thin, gray thread stitching the house to the heavy sky. It was not a welcoming sight. It was a fortress, a bastion against the wilderness, built for endurance, not for comfort. Inside, the cabin was a testament to its owner. It was brutally simple, scrubbed clean, but profoundly empty. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept bare. A long table and 2 benches occupied the center of the main room. A few shelves held a sparse collection of plates and tins. It was the home of a man who did not live in it so much as occupy it. The air was thick with a silence that felt ancient and heavy, the accumulated quiet of 1,000 lonely meals, 1,000 solitary nights. It was a silence that had weight, that pressed in on the ears. Silas moved with purpose, lighting a second lamp that cast flickering, dancing shadows on the log walls. "There's stew on the stove," he said, gesturing with his chin. "Loft is yours. There are pallets and blankets up there." He didn't offer to help her, didn't show her around. He stated the facts, and then turned to stoke the fire, his back to them. He had brought them here, but he was making it clear that they were on their own. They were a necessity he had acquired, like a new axe or a sack of flour. Ilara helped Leo, his small body stiff with cold and exhaustion, out of his coat. The warmth of the cabin was a shock, a physical blow that made her dizzy. The smell of the stew, rich with meat and herbs, was agonizing. She ladled 2 bowls, her hands shaking slightly. She and Leo sat at one end of the long table, while Silas remained by the fire, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The first meal was an exercise in contrasts. Ilara and Leo ate with a ravenous, desperate hunger that bordered on pain. Each spoonful was a confirmation of their survival, a small victory against the cold and starvation that had been their constant companions. Silas did not eat. He simply worked, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the space between them. He watched them from the corner of his eye, his expression unreadable, a detached curiosity in his gaze. He was observing a phenomenon, like a naturalist watching a pair of starved animals finally find food. The gulf between their states of being was a chasm that felt impossible to cross. He was the provider, they were the recipients, and the transaction was complete. For now. Later, in the loft, tucked under a mountain of heavy wool and buffalo hides, Ilara lay awake, listening to the storm rage outside. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the snow beat a frantic tattoo against the roof. Leo slept beside her, his breathing finally deep and even, his small body radiating a warmth she hadn't felt in weeks. Down below, a single floorboard creaked. She knew Silas was awake too, a solitary figure in the darkness of his empty house. She had traded one kind of precariousness for another. She had a roof, she had food, but she was bound to a stranger by a strange and brittle promise. She was safe for the winter, but she was not home. The storm lasted for 3 days, a relentless siege of wind and snow that buried the valley in a deep, silent blanket of white. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist, replaced by a swirling vortex of gray and white seen through the frosted panes of the windows. The confinement forced a strange, silent rhythm upon the cabin's 3 occupants. Silas was a restless presence, always in motion. He mended harnesses in the flickering lamplight, his large hands surprisingly deft. He organized his tools, cleaned his rifle, and paced the length of the main room like a caged animal, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was to issue a simple instruction or state a plain fact. Ilara, in turn, established her own domain. She took over the kitchen and the hearth, her quiet efficiency a stark contrast to his restless energy. She learned the landscape of his pantry, the simple, sturdy provisions he kept. She baked bread, the warm, yeasty smell a tentative domestic scent in the sterile masculine air of the cabin. She mended Leo's coat with thread she found in a dusty sewing box, her stitches small and perfect. She did not ask for permission. She simply did what needed to be done, creating order in her small corner of his world. Leo, after the first day of timid watchfulness, began to explore. He was a quiet child, his boisterous nature muted by months of hardship. He discovered a small box of carved wooden animals tucked away on a high shelf. A bear, a deer, a hawk with outstretched wings. He would sit for hours by the fire, arranging them in silent, intricate dramas. Silas would watch him sometimes, his work stilled, a flicker of something unreadable, pain, memory, regret in his eyes, before he would turn away, the mask of stoic indifference falling back into place. On the 4th morning, they awoke to a world transformed. The storm had broken, and a brilliant, blinding sun shone from a sapphire sky, turning the snow-covered landscape into a sea of diamonds. The silence was absolute, the air crisp and clean, and cold enough to steal one's breath. When Silas opened the cabin door, they were met with a wall of snow that reached halfway up the frame. "The drifts are high," he stated, pulling on his heavy coat and hat. "Barn needs clearing. Animals need to be seen to." It was clear he intended to do the work alone. "I will help," Ilara said. It was not a question or a plea. It was a statement. Silas paused, his hand on the door latch. He looked at her slender frame and city-soft hands. "This isn't work for you." "I will not be a sheltered pet," she replied, her voice low but firm, her chin tilted in that familiar gesture of quiet defiance. "We are earning our keep. Leo can stay by the fire. I will work." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze assessing. He seemed to be weighing her resolve against her perceived fragility. Finally, he gave a short, sharp nod. "There's a smaller shovel by the woodpile. Find some warmer gloves in that chest." He didn't wait for her, pushing the door open against the snow and stepping out into the blinding light. He reluctantly agreed, but he expected her to last an hour at most. The cold was brutal, and the work was backbreaking. He was wrong. She worked with a fierce, determined energy that surprised him. She was not strong in the way he was strong, but she was tireless and intelligent. She learned to use her weight and leverage with the shovel, her movements becoming more efficient as the morning wore on. She did not complain. She did not falter. Her face grew raw with the cold, her breath pluming in the frigid air, but she kept pace with him, her silence a match for his own. They worked for hours, carving a path to the barn, the only sounds the scrape of their shovels and their own labored breathing. Inside the warm, animal-scented dark of the barn, he showed her how to milk the single dairy cow, how to measure out the feed for the horses. Her hands were gentle and sure with the animals, and they responded to her with a calm that they rarely showed him. As they worked, he found himself observing her, not as an employer assesses an employee, but as a man notices a woman. He saw the strength in the slender line of her back, the intelligence in her dark, watchful eyes, the stubborn pride in the set of her jaw. She was not broken, this woman. She was forged of a finer, more resilient steel than he had first imagined. Late in the afternoon, while clearing a space in a storage shed, Ilara's hand brushed against a large, dust-covered trunk tucked away in a dark corner. The lid was unlatched. Curiosity, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in a long time, got the better of her. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, folded neatly, were a woman's clothes, simple dresses of calico and wool. Beneath them lay a small, leather-bound book of poetry, and, tucked inside its pages, a child's drawing. It was a crude, colorful picture of 3 stick figures under a lopsided sun, a tall man, a woman with long yellow hair, and a small girl with a bright red dress. She closed the lid quickly, a pang of guilt and a deeper, more profound sorrow striking her. This was the source of the cabin's oppressive silence. This was the ghost that haunted the solitary man. She looked over at him, now pitching hay down from the loft, his powerful shoulders moving with a familiar, relentless rhythm. He was not just empty. He was hollowed out, and she, a stranger with her own ghosts, was now living inside that hollow space. The realization settled on her not with fear, but with a strange, aching sense of connection. A month passed. The initial brittle arrangement softened into a routine that was almost comfortable. It was a life measured in simple, repeating tasks: the pre-dawn fire, the milking, the mending, the evening meal. Words remained a scarce commodity between them, but a silent language of shared space and mutual respect began to form. They learned the cadence of each other's footsteps, the meaning of a shared glance across the dinner table. But the fragile peace of their isolation was not destined to last. A trip to town for supplies became a necessity. The town felt different now. When Silas pulled the wagon to a stop outside the mercantile, Alara felt the stairs like a physical touch. Whispers followed them up the wooden steps, the venomous little seeds of gossip that had clearly taken root in their absence. Inside the store, the air grew thick with a hostile curiosity. The source of that hostility soon made her appearance. She was a woman of middle age, dressed in a gown of dark, expensive wool that stood in stark contrast to the rough-spun clothing of the other townsfolk. Her face was pinched with a look of perpetual disapproval, and she carried herself with the unshakable authority of a woman whose husband owned half the valley. This was Mistress Albright, the town's self-appointed arbiter of morality. She approached them with a smile that did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Mr. Silas," she said, her voice dripping with false pleasantry, "we had all begun to worry. So isolated up there, especially after the big snow." Her gaze slid over to Alara and Leo, dismissing the boy and settling on the woman with an invasive, appraising look. "And you have acquired help?" "This is my wife, Alara," Silas said, his voice flat and even, a stone wall against her insinuation. "And our son, Leo." Mistress Albright's thin eyebrows arched in feigned surprise. "Your wife? How sudden, and how convenient. A man like you, all alone, and a woman like, well, a woman with a child and no connections. One does wonder about the particulars of such an arrangement." The words were aimed at Silas, but the poison was meant for Alara. It was a public shaming, an attempt to strip her of her dignity and recast her as a woman of loose morals who had trapped a lonely man. The other patrons in the store fell silent, their faces a mixture of avid curiosity and cruel enjoyment. Alara felt a hot flush of shame and anger creep up her neck. She drew Leo closer, her body a shield against the woman's venom. She had faced down starvation, freezing cold, and the loss of everything she had ever known. She would not be broken by the petty cruelty of this small-minded woman. Before she could speak, Silas moved. It was a small, almost imperceptible shift, but it changed the entire dynamic of the room. He stepped slightly forward, placing himself between Mistress Albright and his family. The gesture was subtle, but its meaning was absolute. He was a physical barrier, a protector. "The particulars," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous quiet that was far more intimidating than a shout, "are none of your concern. She is my wife. This is my son. You will show them the respect that their position affords them." He did not raise his voice, but the quiet authority in his tone silenced the room. He held Mistress Albright's gaze, his own eyes as cold and hard as river stones, until she was the first to look away, her face tight with fury and humiliation. He had not just defended her, he had publicly claimed them. The legal fiction they had constructed for survival had just been forged into something real and solid in the fire of public confrontation. Without another word, Silas gathered their supplies, paid the stunned shopkeeper, and led Alara and Leo from the store. The ride back to the homestead was thick with a new, heavy silence. The unspoken things between them had multiplied. The fragile peace of their refuge had been shattered, and Alara knew, with a sinking certainty, that the warning shot fired by Mistress Albright was only the beginning. The world was not going to leave them alone in their valley. It was coming for them. The confession came that night, born of the tension that had followed them home from town. After Leo was asleep in the loft, Alara came back down to find Silas staring into the fire, a silhouette of profound loneliness. The air in the cabin was heavy, charged with the aftershocks of the confrontation and the weight of the lie he had so fiercely defended. The silence that was once a neutral space between them was now filled with questions. She stood by the table, her hands clasped together. She had to know. She had to understand the man who had drawn a line in the sand for her, a stranger he was bound to only by a desperate bargain. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the quiet of the room. "Why did you do that? In the store? Why did you help us at all?" He did not turn. For a long time the only sounds were the crackle of the logs in the hearth and the low moan of the wind outside. She thought he would not answer, that he would retreat back into the fortress of his silence. But then he spoke, his voice rough with an emotion he had kept locked away for years. "Because this cabin had too much nothing in it," he said, his gaze fixed on the flames. "After they were gone, after Sarah and Lily, the silence was a living thing. It ate at me. Every creak of the floorboards was the sound of them not being here. Every sunrise was a reminder of a day I had to face alone." He finally turned to look at her, and in the flickering firelight she saw the raw grief he kept so carefully hidden from the world. The mask was gone. "My wife, Sarah, and our daughter, Lily. A fever took them both one winter, the same week. I buried them myself, up on the ridge where the aspens grow. After that, I just existed. I worked until I couldn't stand, and I slept because I was too exhausted not to. But I wasn't living." He looked down at his own large, calloused hands. "Then I saw you. You and the boy. You had nothing left. I had too much nothing. I thought maybe your quiet could fill up some of my silence, make it a different kind of quiet. It was selfish, a business transaction. That's all it was supposed to be." He shook his head slowly. "But that woman today, when she looked at you with that poison in her eyes, I realized it wasn't a transaction anymore. I couldn't let her hurt you. I couldn't stand by and watch another family be destroyed in this valley." The raw honesty of his confession cracked open something inside Ilara. His pain was a mirror to her own. In his grief, she saw the shape of her loss. In response to his vulnerability, she offered her own. She walked to a small chest where she kept her few meager possessions and retrieved a small silk-wrapped object. She returned to the table and unwrapped it. In her palm lay a jade butterfly, its wing broken. "My husband was a teacher," she said softly, her fingers tracing the fractured stone. "He wrote things the men in power did not like. They called him a traitor. One night they came for him. He gave me this," she held up the butterfly, "and told me to run, to take our son and never look back. It was his mother's. It was all he had left of her." Her voice trembled, but she did not weep. "His brother, his own brother, was one of the men who came for him. He believes my husband left something of value with me, deeds, money. He sees Leo not as his nephew, but as an asset to be controlled. We have been running from him for almost a year. He is a patient man, a cruel one. We had nothing left when we reached that town. We were at the end." She looked up and met his gaze. "You didn't just offer me a roof, Silas. You offered me a fortress. And today, you stood on its walls. Now you know what you are defending." The exchange transformed them, the last of the pretense between employer and employee, between stranger and stranger, dissolved in the warm light of the fire. They were no longer just a man and a woman bound by convenience. They were two survivors, allies united by shared loss and a common, looming threat. He understood now that the danger was not just the town's prejudice or the coming winter. The true danger was a relentless man from her past, a man who would not stop until he had what he wanted. The marriage of convenience had become a pact of protection, and Silas knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would not, could not, let this fortress fall. Spring arrived hesitantly in the high valley, a slow, grudging retreat of winter. The snow receded from the lower elevations, leaving the earth brown and sodden. The creeks swelled with meltwater, their roar a constant presence. It was a season of awakening, but for the occupants of the small cabin, it brought with it a sense of impending dread. The clearing of the mountain passes meant the world could once again reach them. The threat arrived not as a dramatic thunderclap, but as a quiet, insidious rumor that drifted up from the town. A stranger was asking questions. A well-dressed man with city manners and cold eyes, asking about a woman and a boy new to the area. He came to the homestead on a Tuesday. Elara saw him first, a lone rider on a fine black horse, picking his way up the muddy track to their cabin. Her heart seized in her chest. She knew, with a sickening certainty, who it was. She grabbed Leo and pulled him inside, her hands trembling as she barred the door. Silas was in the barn, but he saw the rider too. He emerged, wiping his hands on a rag, his body calm, but his eyes narrowed and watchful. He positioned himself on the porch, a solid, immovable object. The man was exactly as Elara had described him. His clothes were expensive, his boots polished despite the mud. He dismounted with a fluid grace and smiled a thin, predatory smile. He was the picture of civilized authority, a stark contrast to Silas's rough-hewn presence. He was the broker. "A charmingly rustic location," the broker said, his eyes sweeping over the homestead with a dismissive air. "I am looking for my sister-in-law, Elara, and my dear nephew, Leo. I have been given to understand they are residing here." "They are," Silas said, his voice flat. "Excellent. Their period of rusticating is over. I have come to take them home." He produced a sheaf of papers from an inside pocket of his coat. "I have the legal documents, full guardianship of the boy as his closest living male relative, and administration of my late brother's estate. She is, I'm afraid, not mentally fit to care for him." Silas didn't even glance at the papers. "She's my wife. The boy is my son. They're not going anywhere." The broker's smile widened, a humorless baring of teeth. "Ah, yes, the marriage. A clever, if transparent, little ploy. It will not stand up in court, I assure you. This is a legal matter. You are interfering with my lawful duty. I will return in 3 days with the marshal. If you do not hand them over, you will be charged with kidnapping. I suggest you contemplate your position." He mounted his horse, gave Silas a final smug look, and rode away, leaving his ultimatum hanging in the air like poison. That night, the cabin became a war room. The cozy domesticity of the past months vanished, replaced by a grim, desperate urgency. By the light of an oil lamp, they spread out the few papers Elara had managed to keep from her husband's life. Most were letters and academic notes, but tucked within a book was a thin ledger. "I don't know if it's anything," she said, her voice strained. "My husband kept records of his brother's business dealings. He said his brother was creative with his accounting." Elara, it turned out, was more than just a teacher's wife. Her father had been a merchant, and she understood numbers. Her finger traced the columns of figures, her brow furrowed in concentration. While she worked, Silas paced. He was a man of action, of physical solutions, and this war of paper and law was foreign territory. He felt a rising tide of helplessness, but as he paced, a memory surfaced, something from a life he had lived long before Sarah and Lily, before this ranch, a life he had buried. He stopped, a sudden stillness coming over him. "There's a man," he said, his voice low, "in the capital. We served together a long time ago. He works for the government now. a records keeper, a man who knows things. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. The telegraph lines were just back in service after the winter. A message might reach him in time. It might not. He rode hard for the nearest town with a telegraph office, a full day's journey. He sent a coded message, a relic of his former life, giving the broker's name and a request for any and all official records pertaining to him, warrants, business licenses, legal judgments, anything. The operator looked at him strangely, but sent the message. The wait for a reply would be agonizing. The next 2 days were a blur of tense waiting and frantic searching. Ilara pored over the ledger, her mind sharp, fueled by adrenaline and fear. She found it on the second night. A single entry, a notation of a land deed transfer, with a signature that looked subtly but critically different from the others in the book. It was a forgery, and a clumsy one at that. It was a small thing, a tiny crack in the broker's legal armor, but it was something. On the third day they returned. The broker, astride his fine horse, was accompanied by the town marshal, a weary, reluctant man just doing his job, and, for good measure, Mistress Albright, who had come along in her buggy to witness what she clearly saw as her vindicated triumph. "Silas," the marshal said, his voice heavy with regret, "this man has a court order. I have to enforce it. Don't make this difficult." Silas stood on the porch, Ilara and Leo behind him. He had nothing. The telegraph had not been answered. The ledger entry was flimsy proof. It looked hopeless. "The time for games is over," the broker said, dismounting. "Marshal, do your duty." As the marshal took a step forward, the sound of a horse being ridden at a full gallop echoed up the valley. A moment later, a young man from the telegraph office burst into the clearing, his horse lathered in sweat. He leaped off, holding a piece of paper. "Telegram for Silas," he gasped, handing it over. Silas took it, his hand steady. He read the message, his expression unchanging. Then he read it again, slowly. A long, deep breath escaped his lips. He looked up, his eyes locking onto the broker. "Marshal," Silas said, his voice calm and clear, "you might want to see this." He handed the telegram to the lawman. The marshal read it. His eyes widened. He read it again, then looked from the paper to the broker with a new, hard expression. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. He looked at the broker. "Says here your name isn't what you say it is. Says you're wanted in 3 territories for fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. Says you were never this woman's brother-in-law. You were his business partner, the one who swindled him and ran." The telegram, it turned out, was a copy of an official arrest warrant. The broker's face went white. The smug confidence evaporated, replaced by the cornered look of a rat. He made a move for his horse, but the marshal was faster, his pistol drawn. "I wouldn't," the lawman said, his voice now cold as iron. Mistress Albright watched, her mouth agape, her moment of triumph turning to ash. The entire town would know of this by nightfall. They would know she had championed a wanted criminal, and that the quiet, solitary man on the mountain had outsmarted them all. Humiliation washed over her face. She signaled to her driver, and her buggy turned and fled back down the track in a cloud of dust and disgrace. The marshal clapped the irons on the broker's wrists. As he led the stunned man away, he paused beside Silas. "Looks like you had it handled," he said, a grudging respect in his eyes. He tipped his hat toward Ilara. "Ma'am?" Then he was gone, leaving a stunned, profound silence in his wake. The threat was over. The fortress had held. Silas looked at Ilara, and for the first time a real, genuine smile touched his lips. She smiled back, a wave of triumphant relief so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. Leo, sensing the shift, ran from behind his mother and hugged Silas's leg. Without thinking, Silas reached down and rested a hand on the boy's head. The war was over. The spring that followed was not a hesitant suggestion, but a triumphant declaration. The sun grew warmer, the grass turned a vibrant, impossible green, and the aspens on the high ridge leafed out in a shimmering canopy of silver and gold. The world, it seemed, was breathing a sigh of relief, and so were the three people on the isolated homestead. The ranch itself transformed. The stark, functional emptiness of the place began to fill with the soft sounds of life. Elara planted a garden near the cabin door, rows of hardy vegetables and, in a fit of optimism, a small patch of wildflowers. Their bright, cheerful colors were a defiant splash against the gray logs of the cabin. She hung simple, patched curtains in the windows, and the harsh angles of the interior were softened by their presence. Silas, too, was a man transformed. The restless, haunted energy that had driven him was replaced by a quieter, more purposeful industry. He began building an addition to the cabin, a proper room for Leo and another for them. The sound of his hammer echoed through the valley, not the frantic pounding of a man trying to outrun his ghosts, but the steady, rhythmic work of a man building a future. The profound grief had not vanished, but it had receded. It was no longer the defining feature of his soul, but a scar that he now carried with a quiet acceptance. He smiled more, a slow, unpracticed thing that made his weathered face seem younger. He taught Leo how to whittle, their two heads bent together over a piece of soft pine on the porch steps in the long, golden evenings. The found family was now whole. The legal fiction of their marriage had been alchemized by shared danger and mutual respect into a bond stronger than any court document. They were partners in every sense of the word. She managed the household and the books with a sharp intelligence that continually impressed him, while he worked the land with a renewed sense of purpose. They were a team, their separate strengths woven together into a resilient whole. Their reputation in the town, once a source of scorn, had become one of grudging admiration. The story of how the quiet mountain man and his foreign wife had faced down a city swindler and the town's matriarch had become a local legend. One evening, as the last rays of sunset painted the mountains in hues of rose and violet, they sat together on the newly finished porch. The air was soft and fragrant with the smell of damp earth and pine. Leo was asleep inside, tired out from a day of helping Silas mend fences. The silence between them was no longer empty or tense. It was a comfortable, shared quiet, filled with unspoken understanding. The winter was long over. The terms of their original contract had expired. The mountain passes were clear. She was free to go. The unspoken truth of it hung between them, a final, gentle question. Silas cleared his throat, turning to look at her. Her face was softer in the twilight. The lines of worry and hardship eased. She looked peaceful. She looked home. "The winter's over, Elara," he said, his voice quiet. "The agreement is fulfilled. You're free to leave." He said the words because he had to, because his honor demanded it. But the thought of the cabin returning to its old, crushing silence was a physical ache in his chest. She met his gaze, her dark eyes steady and clear. A small smile touched her lips. "A home is not the land you own, Silas," she said softly. "It is the people you choose to protect on it, and the people who choose to protect you back." She reached out and placed her hand over his on the arm of the chair. "This is our home now, if you'll have us." He looked at their joined hands, then back at her face. He didn't need to say anything. He simply covered her hand with his other, his large, calloused grip gentle and sure. It was a promise. A new contract, not for a season, but for a lifetime. On the high ridge, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, silent witnesses to the quiet, unshakable beginning of a family.